Hello, everyone. My name is Addie from the Green Tara Earth Guardians group. And I am here with a very special friend, a very special being, Shawn. He's a mystic, Christian mystic. We conducted research together at John F. Kennedy University in the Bay Area in California in consciousness. Shawn is also a coach, but more than anything, Shawn is someone who achieved incredible states of consciousness that were described by the mystics, the Christian mystics, that were described by the yogis. And it is not really that common to meet someone with such incredible state of being. I sat next to Shawn in the classroom and I always wanted to sit next to him just to be in his beautiful plasma, to get free enlightenment.
Of course. Thank you for that, great introduction. You've been such a great friend to me as well. Such a affirmation in my life. So I really appreciate your presence. Hi, everybody. My name is Shawn Ellison, as Adele mentioned. It's been a long journey for me, a journey of about 17 years and counting. And I grew up in a very devout Christian family with wonderful parents. And I've always had a deep interest in spirituality, a deep interest in knowing the divine for myself. And so for me, as a young kid, my parents and I were always talking about spirituality, talking about God, talking about these beautiful things. And for me, I wanted to actually experience these things as opposed to just believing in those things. For me, as a Christian growing up, there's a lot of beliefs that we had, but my question to myself was always, do you know this for yourself? Like, do you know this to be true for yourself? Because anything less than that certitude was not enough for me. And so when I was 15, I felt this interior sort of call, or like a whisper. And the whisper was essentially, it's time. It's time to start a journey of a lifetime. It's time to really let go of your anxiety and your fears. And I'm a type 6 on the Enneagram, if you guys are familiar with that. And the type 6 is very anxious, very fearful, especially in the more earlier levels of development. And so to really let go of that fear and to kind of follow this sort of imperceptible call was something that terrified me. But I knew that if I didn't jump on this train at this moment, it might pass me by. And so initially, I wanted to be baptized, and so as a Christian, that's part of the ritual is baptism. We were baptized and it's a turning point in the journey. And for most people, it's more of a, something that we do to initiate ourselves in the Christian journey. But for me, I felt that it was something else, that there was something that had to be done in order to initiate this deeper journey that I was on. And so I asked my father to take me to this retreat that was happening in the Pocono Mountains. I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I wanted to go so badly because I knew that, this place, was where I needed to go to get baptized. And there was a minister there who I really admired at the time. And I wanted to have him do it because I really had a lot of trust and confidence in him. And so, I went to this retreat with my brother and my family, and I was baptized. And when I came up from the water, there was this sense that my egoic boundaries fell away. So it was a radical sense of oneness and unification. And initially, when I came up from the water, it was this dumbfounded sort of response because the separation between myself, others, the physical building that I was in, right? All of that fell away completely. And instead, there was this beautiful sort of a unity experience where there was a very delicate joy, bliss, a peace. And yet I was mesmerized by it. There was a sense of this experience is unusual, right? And so as I proceeded to leave the pool where I was baptized, this experience sort of, slowly reverted back to my normal egoic state. But then I knew at that time that there was something mysterious about this experience. And I had not known any Christian in my immediate life that had an experience like that. So I kept it to myself, but yet it was almost a glimpse. into a possibility, a glimpse into a higher state of being. And that's where it sort of started for me. And then going forward, I began to really surrender into this journey. So a couple of years after that initial baptism experience, I went home and I spent literally hours in prayer. I was going to school, coming home, and just going into prayer. And as a kid, I didn't know how to pray. It was more like, asking almost like childlike prayers, asking God for revelation, for understanding, for an experience. And I was trying to recapture that experience again, but I didn't know how to. I did everything I possibly could, fasting, reading the Bible a lot, and nothing really worked for me. And so when I actually, I got depressed after a while, because I'm trying to, reignite this experience. I'm trying to, sort of reignite it again in myself, and I couldn't do it. And so I noticed that I got to a point where I felt discouraged. And I said to myself, maybe I should find a different religion. Maybe this religion is not for me. So there's a moment of crisis in my faith at that time where it was, maybe this just happened as a fluke. Maybe this is not something that is even really a permanent possibility for me. But yet something inside of me told me that stay the course. Stay the course. There is something here that God is doing for you. And before I even go further with this, I want to define God for a second, because we all have our sort of preconceived notions of what God is. And for me, God is not mythic, meaning that God is not, some old bearded guy in the sky. God is not on some throne in some, physical place. God's not any of that. God for me is infinite being, eternal presence, ultimate spirit. So whatever your term is for God, you can sort of use that as I'm sort of sharing what's happening in my life with the divine, because a lot of folks I understand have a lot of trauma around the term God. It's been used to manipulate, to denigrate. There's a lot of misuses with the term God. So when I mean the term God, I don't mean the mythic sort of traditional fundamentalist understanding of it. For me, God is infinite spirit, infinite presence. And so I go forward in my journey. And when I was about 16, 17, I began to notice in my times of prayer that I would sort of fall into silence. And so I would start speaking to the divine, and then I would just fall into silence. And there was no words, there were no thoughts, there were no memories, no sense of being anywhere particular, just a sense of simple presence. And this also scared me, because I was like, this is not in the Bible. I don't know where this experience is. So there's a lot of fear coming up, because I was always measuring my experiences against scriptures, right? Which I naturally did at the time. I had not heard of mysticism, contemplation, changes of consciousness, enlightenment, all of these moksha and all these different types of states. All of that was after the fact. But in the moment, I was just a kid, 16 years old, 17 years old, just sort of following the breadcrumbs. And so I noticed that something was happening inside of me. And I knew that I had to sort of continue my trust in this process. So when I was 17, I was working in an auto mechanic by my house. And one day I was actually doing my chores in the garage. And that's when I felt this interior welling up of some type of power or force. And it was kind of pulling my consciousness inward, like downward into my body. And as it started happening, I started to black out, like right there as I was sweeping. And I started to lose my legs. And my boss, Mike, said, "Shawnee boy," he was like, "What are you doing?" And I kind of snapped out of it. And I was like, "Oh, sorry." I just kind of lost it for a second. But I was terrified again, because why was I blacking out? Why was I losing consciousness? It felt like I was going to this deep, dark void in myself. And this void was contextless. There was nothing in it that told me it was a theological phenomenon or a religious phenomenon or even a spiritual experience. But yet it was happening to me. And I was utterly terrified. And so when I went home that day, I sat down on my couch. Our room was in the basement at that time. And so I sat down on the couch and I sort of kind of let go, because I was kind of fighting this pull inward, because I was so terrified of it happening in public. So I went home that day, I sat, on the couch in our room. And I said, let me just stop resisting this. It was kind of like fighting a giant. And I finally let go. And again, it happened, this sense of being pulled inward, and I'm blacking out again. And I feel my awareness slipping away. And it feels like the onset of death. That's what it felt like. It was this sense of my body is sort of shutting down. My senses, my physical senses are diminishing. My sense of having a self is diminishing, and I'm falling into this void. And at the point of almost completion of that inward pull, my father came in through the side door of the basement, and he startled me. And so I kind of resisted right then in that moment and started crying. And my father, kind of like chuckled, like, son, what's going on? And he said, come here. So I got up and I went to my father crying, and he held me in that moment. And he asked me, he said, son, what's wrong? And I said, Dad, I don't know. I don't know what's going on with me, right? Like a little boy being held by his father. I felt secure in that moment. My father was holding me in this state of vulnerability. He didn't know what was happening, but there was something prolific happening inside of me. As I sat there on his shoulder kind of crying, I knew that I had to have this experience again without interruptions. And it felt almost like a shadow of God was kind of passing by. This mystical shadow or cloud was kind of hovering around me. And I knew I had to sort of climb the mountain that night. I had this metaphor in my mind. I had to climb the mountain. I had to go to the peak to see for myself what God's going to reveal to me. I have to do it, even if it kills me. Because at this point, I thought to myself, I might go to this experience and not come back. I might die. And that's what I felt. And so that night, I went upstairs to a room in my house, and I locked the door. It's like 11 o'clock at night. My parents were asleep. My brother was downstairs on the computer. And I went and I sat on the bed, across my legs in a yoga position. And I was reading my Bible. I was reading about Pentecost. And Pentecost was a moment in Christian history wherein the Holy Spirit, it was said, descended upon the disciples. And that's when they got that gift of the Holy Spirit. And so I was reading about that because I felt that encounter that they had was so profound. I felt that there was something similar that was coming my way. So I wanted to kind of prepare for it. And so I sat there on that bed. As I sat there, there was a movement in the room. So there's a window to my left. And I saw this foggy, sort of mystical, kind of a cloud come into the room, like a misty shower almost. It came into the room. It was a very physical thing. Right? It looked like actual fog or a cloud. And so as it came into the room, I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, am I going crazy? Am I losing my mind? And I'm watching this come into the room. And I'm at this point really terrified. And so I'm holding my breath and I'm kind of in suspense, holding my breath, looking at this cloud coming into the room. And as it came into the room, it started to surround me. It surrounded my head. My whole body was kind of submersed in this cloud. And as I kind of looked around, there was this sense of intelligence. Like this, whatever this was, it wasn't just a natural phenomenon. This was something that was intelligent, inherently intelligent, and that it was sort of watching me, sort of like deliberating. And I'm watching this cloud, this formlessness, and then suddenly I felt a piercing at the top of my head, and it felt like 1,000 knives kind of cut through me. And I felt this rush, this immense force rushing downward through the body. And at this point, when this thing came through, it was like a hammer hit me. Like I was immediately stunned and disoriented. And it's traveling down in me. And this sense is overwhelming. It's really hard to describe this sense of overwhelm. It was really a divine invasion. It felt like I was invaded by this unknown power. And I was invaded by this as it's coming down, it's traveling super fast, like a comet. It's traveling downward. And it hits the midsection of my body, right? The first chakra. And then I felt something crack at the very base of my spine. And then this force sort of turned around, began to rise upward. But at the same time, it was an ascent, right? It was a descent and also an ascent. So as it's going upward, there's now a sense of expansion. And so I'm looking at my hands and my feet, and I'm asking myself, how is it that I'm not expanding physically? Because I felt my awareness expanding in such a profound way. And so there's this sense of amazing power kind of rising upward. As it's rising upward, it passes my throat, and I begin speaking in what is called an unknown tongue in Christianity, an unknown tongue. And after it cleared my throat chakra, it goes way up past my head. And once it gets past my head, I'm gone. There's no sense of self. There's no time. There's no space. There's no thought. There's no body. There's no sense of being a person, being on the planet, a complete ecstasy, a complete rapture. And I'm in this formless state. When I say I don't mean like personal me. I'm just using it metaphorically. But I was in this immense vastness. And in this state, I saw how omniscience worked. I saw how omnipotence worked. Because I was literally, the only thing I could think of is I'm God. The experience was I am God. Not like me as a person, but in that expansive state, it was like I am God. And that was the implication of the experience, that I was somehow participating in divinity directly. And this is beyond any type of physicality or any type of realm that's associated with the universe. It was a whole different realm completely. And after some time, maybe a few minutes, there was now the reemergence of self. And so if this was like a balloon, the balloon kind of, blew up to the point where it just ceased to exist. And then now this balloon returned. And as it returned, there was this sense of contraction. So if you can imagine this, you're being blown up by divine air, and it's going. And the balloon gets more and more translucent because it's being stretched. And so the sense is that, my human limits are being stretched. And so you stretch to the point of non-existence, and all of a sudden you reemerge, and now you're back into density. And so this thing is now contracting backward into itself. And when it contracted, I felt this contraction kind of localized right in the center of my chest. And once it contracted, there was then another emergence, this birth, this conception of divine presence from the center of my body. So this is another expansion, and it blows up. And now there's this sense of euphoria, utter euphoria of bliss, joy, peace. And any descriptor you can think of to describe a divine experience is now expanding from the chest. And now I'm really overwhelmed at this point because all these things are happening all at once. And as I'm sitting here, my hands are shaking. I'm convulsing. I'm literally seizing because now it's all this energy just radiating head to toe. And I'm crying, I'm weeping. I mean, there's so much energy. And I'm looking at my hands, and my bones are melting. Like, I feel like the bones were kind of grinding against this energy. And I'm like, looking at myself like, how am I alive? Because I'm sitting here thinking, I'm literally in between realms right now. Like, a part of me is still afoot in this other no self transcendent dimension, and the other part of me is still on the planet. And so there's this sense of cognitive dissonance, where it's like I'm between two places, and yet here I am with this energy radiating through me. And so I'm sitting here, you guys, and I'm beside myself. Like, I can't explain to you just how hysterical I was, because there was so much energy at this point. And mind you, I hadn't heard of mysticism, hadn't heard of contemplation, hadn't heard of enlightenment experiences, none of it. I mean, I'm just a basic Protestant Christian who knows nothing. And I'm just now having all these experiences. And I'm sitting on the bed, and I say to myself, I have to get up. So I get up, and then I just fall on the ground because my body felt so light. It was like I was walking on air. The entire body felt like it was formless. And I feel like I lost the power of my limbs. So I'm trying to grab the chair and trying to grab the table to get up. And my legs are wobbly. I can't even stand. And yet it's this radiating energy, this presence of God. It's like overwhelming me. And so I get up, and I'm at this point, I'm dumbfounded. And I'm stumbling through the hallway. I get to the staircase, and I'm falling down the steps. Basically, my brother heard me. And I get to the main level of our house. And my brother sees me. And he sees my condition, and my brother is horrified, like mortified, because I'm shaking, I'm convulsing, I'm crying. All these things are happening, and he's trying to. He goes to the phone to call 911. He thought it was a medical emergency. He said he grabs the phone, And I'm like waving like, don't do it. But I couldn't speak. I was mute. He said, what happened to you? And I tried to open my mouth. Nothing would come out. I literally could not speak. And it felt like I saw the infinite glory and was speechless. Like I couldn't even speak. And so he reluctantly puts the phone back on the hook. And I go down to the basement where our room was. And I crawl into bed. And I am overwhelmed to such a profound extent that I just get in bed. And I'm curled up in a fetal position. And I'm shaking, convulsing, crying, seizing. And my brother is sitting across from me, you know, listening, waiting for me to say something. And then by the time maybe a half an hour goes by, I say to him, God. That's all I said, God. And he kind of shook his head like, okay. And I fell asleep. And the next day I woke up. To my surprise, the experience was still there. The bliss, the euphoria, the sense of expansion, the sense of divine presence, the sense of God being in my cells, in my blood. So this being flooded over with this presence was still there. And I was shocked because I went to sleep that night thinking, okay, I'll wake up tomorrow morning and I'll be normal again. I would never again experience that. That was the peak of my life. I never will experience anything like that ever again in my life. But to my utter surprise, I woke up with this same presence. And I look back on this now, understanding that that was a full-blown, you know, Kundalini awakening experience, plus other things on top of it. And so, you know, for me, you know, that was the start. I call that experience my mystical conversion experience, because after that experience happened to me, I was never again the same. I was never again the same. It was like my whole consciousness world was totally reconfigured. It had to be reassembled. Because when I came back to myself, I knew that I was never again the same. That the person that I was prior to that experience had died, and that this new person was being born. And in that moment, I thought to myself, wow, like this is what I wanted. This is what I desired more than anything else, was to see God face to face. And what always baffled me was this notion, because I knew in my heart that I had saw God face to face and lived. But I saw God face to face and lived. And to me, it showed me the grace that also was a part of this experience that really gave me the resilience to see, because I was almost straddling death at multiple points with this experience. It was that overwhelming for me. And so that was the start of my mystical experience. And, you know, you can kind of go from there, Adele, but that was the experience. And I'm quite certain that without that experience, I don't know where I'll be today. I don't know who I'll be today. That experience was such a defining moment in my life, the most extraordinary moment of my life. And that's when the journey really picked up from there. Yeah, so I was 17 when that happened. So I was going into my senior year of college. And so for the next 4 years, that experience initiated a Saint Teresa of Avila intensity. So if you were familiar with Saint Teresa of Avila, she described multiple spiritual phenomena, raptures, ecstasies, flights of the spirit, out-of-body experiences, divine presence. I mean, she was really the archetype of my own experience. So after that day, I went online and I bought all these books. And so I went online, I'm typing in these random terms into Google. And like I said, I didn't know anything about anything. And so I'm looking at all these different books and I come across St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. And I buy these books. And my mother is like, why are you buying all these books? You know, and I was like, you know, just gotta, you know, stay educated. I didn't tell her anything. I didn't tell my parents anything. You know, I was like, you know, this is, who would believe me? You know, there's a sense that who can believe this, right? My brother was there and he was an eyewitness to this. So he saw it. And he always tells me, like, I was there. Like, I saw the encounter. Like, I saw what happened to you, right? So I told my parents a little later, but I bought all these books. And so that's when I discovered, to my surprise, that there's all these mystics, these Christian mystics. And for the first time, mystic entered my vocabulary, because I had not heard of mysticism prior to this experience. And I started reading all these books, and I began to think, I'm not crazy, because the initial response is like, I'm crazy, right? This experience is so utterly transcendent. Like, who can ever put it into words, or who can ever, really describe what this is? And reading these mystics, I bought like 35 books, and I'm devouring all these books. I'm reading, okay, how do I now live this new life? How do I function? How do I, live in a way that is productive? I thought I might end up in a hospital or something, or end up in a situation where I couldn't care for myself. And that's how powerful the experiences were. So after that day, every day, I had those experiences every day. My prayers became, I'll go into prayer, I would just black out, and I would be in that infinite vast space. It happened on a daily basis, and it became my life. And anyone that has these sort of experiences, they become normal to you. As hard as it is to fathom, like, it becomes normal to you because you've experienced them so much that now your new life, your new normal, is experiencing the transcendence of the divine, and that's what you experience. And I had this sense of a passive presence of God. I was going to school, I'm in the subway, I'm playing sports, and where I was doing, there was this natural awareness of God at this point. And for me, over the next 4 years, what happened was this coming and going of my experiences. Some days I'll wake up and they're there, the next day they're gone. The next day I'll wake up, they're back, the next day they're gone. And so for me as a Christian mystic, you learn what does it mean to love God, right? Because it's easy to love God with experiences. It's like, oh, you give someone an experience, they'll love anything, right? And so as a Christian mystic, the goal is always to love God for God, period. And that means to love God without experiences. And so for me, the trial, the test over the next 4 years was, how can I learn to love God selflessly? How can I learn to serve the divine without anything in it for me? Because these experiences were like goodies, and God would drop all these things. And it's like, well, anybody will love God in this situation. But when you're empty, when you're dry, when you're arid, when there's nothing happening, what then? And so I learned a lot of hard lessons early on, lessons of detachment, of learning that to love the divine is not about experiences, right? It's about the commitment. It's about the utter dedication to the divine. It's not based on experiences. And so for the next 4 years, going to college, and I'm still experiencing, all these different things. And I learned that my experiences were still immature, meaning that my experiences were powerful for sure, but they weren't permanent. The fact that God came and went all the time told me that my experience was incomplete. Because what I wanted more than anything else was to be aware of God all the time. When you love somebody, right, they're with you all the time. They're in your thoughts, they're in your mind, your feelings, your emotions, right? Your whole being is centered on that person, because that's what love is. Love is that sense of consummation. And so even when God was gone, of course, you miss the divine. I miss feeling God near me. I miss being close to the divine, right? And so I knew there was a deeper state possible. I had studied that from some of the mystics that I read. And so when I was 21, I was driving to volunteer with a friend. I was a passenger when I felt this veil fall down from over my head. It came down really gently, and it came and shrouded my mind very quietly. And immediately my mind was altered in some mysterious way. And I didn't know what it was though, because I felt like almost like a twinge above my head, like something's up there. And then I kind of like paying attention now, and it comes down and it shrouds my whole mind, my whole head. And so I go to volunteer, and I'm just kind of doing what I was assigned to do. And my friend says to me, "Are you okay? Like, something's not right with you." And I said, "Something happened to me." And she said, "Something's always happening to you." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's true, but this is different. Something has happened to me that's devastating." So I go home that day to my dorm, and I was an RA because I knew that I needed privacy. My life was so chaotic with God, with blackout everywhere. I had to have my own room. So I was the resident assistant. So I went back to my room, I sat there, and I said to myself, something is not right with me. Something has changed. And so I kept kind of observing this experience. But all the while, there was no experiences of the divine at all. There was nothing. It was complete silence. But yet I felt my mind was altered in some way. It was almost as if I was living in a disoriented state. And so I kept, living my life, observing. My memory was sluggish. I couldn't recall things. I couldn't remember certain things. It felt like I didn't have any power. I felt powerless in myself. And so one day I decided, well, I feel alone. I feel like I've lost the divine. Let me actually turn within myself and look for that presence again. It's always there when I need it. And I turned within myself. And instead of actually seeing the divine presence, I saw a black hole in the center of my being, like a literal black hole like that in the void of my being. And upon seeing that, I was utterly mortified. I saw this in myself. And it was like the death of God. Literally, like God died in the center of my soul. It's a big black hole. And that's when I realized at that point in time that I had entered what's called the dark night of the spirit, which is a term coined by John of the Cross. And this is a dire night that really ushers in a radical alteration of consciousness. And so what happened from this experience was, number one, the third eye opened up. So I had this immense pressure in my, right in the middle of my forehead, and my eyes were pulsating with immense pressure all the time for years after that. For about 3 years from that moment, my eyes were always, it's almost like see. And I'm like, see what? This intense pressure. So that had a lot of physical symptoms to this as well. And so I noticed that, okay, God has died inside of me. Of course, I was depressed. I was sad. I was sort of resentful. God, I gave you everything. I gave you my whole life, and yet you left me, right? So there's this egoic response, where it's like, I don't deserve this, right? And it's human nature to blame God when things go wrong. And so, but I decided, okay, well, I miss God, and God apparently has died. What do I do now? I read a book by a Christian contemplative named Bernadette Roberts, who's one of my favorites. And she talked about this particular event. And what happens here is that, to do a little explaining, is that consciousness is both reflective and reflexive, right? So reflective consciousness is what we think of when we talk about being self-aware. It's our thoughts, our memories, our experiences, our feelings, our emotions, our embodiment, right? All the things that we think of when it comes to consciousness, that's the reflective level, right? The reflexive level of consciousness is something that's more subtle than that. So reflexive consciousness is basically that part of consciousness that is happening all the time. So self-awareness actually precedes the reflective level, right? And so we think that our first level of awareness is the reflection, but that's not true. The first level is actually the reflexive level, where it's more like a simple experience of being, right? So for example, if you go for a hike, right, or you're going for a long drive, or you're going with something that's really quieting for yourself, right? You're sort of resting in a very simple presence, in a way, a very subtle experience of being, right? And that's prior to thought. And if you notice, sometimes, in your life, there are moments when there's no thoughts at all. There's more of a resting in this quiet sense of being. But what we don't understand is that resting on that level is also the reflexivity of consciousness. It's consciousness aware of itself in an unconscious way. So we're consciously self-aware, and we're also unconsciously self-aware, right? Most people don't see that distinction. And so we can call this deeper level, this reflexive level, presencing or essential presence, right? People like Almas and his diamond approach talk about how do we get to this essential presence, right? And that's going beyond the thought and going below thought to just simple presence. So what happens in this dark night is that God actually breaks into the reflexive level. So that simple presencing, that simple being, that is removed, annihilated, ripped out. And in its wake is this big black hole in the center of self. And so now the journey is going through this black hole, downward into the depths of our own nothingness. And for me, as I did this, I spent my prayers then became me sitting in quiet and actually journeying through this big dark portal in the center of my soul. So I was going down this portal, and the portal is literally nothing. Like there's nothing. It's complete and absolute emptiness. There's no context, there's no motion, there's nothing, just emptiness. And so I'm going down this vortex of emptiness. And it took me about 4 months to really journey down this void in myself. So I'm going down, and at some point you get to the bottom of the void, and the void is like solid. It's rock solid. So you feel like your feet sort of land on the ground. There's actually a physical sensation. It's like you land and it's like boom. And it's like, wait a minute. Like, is there anything deeper than this? And it's like, no, like this is actually the ground. And we often confuse the simple presencing with the ground, but there's actually a ground that's beneath that is really the divine ground. The divine ground of creation is actually underneath that level. And so some people call this simple presencing the egoic center of consciousness or the self-center of consciousness, but God removes that in the dark night. And now we're living on this deeper level, which is as far down inside of the self that we can go. So this is the deeper than deep. You're like way down in the depths of the ocean deep, but you actually are on solid ground. So I got to that point, and I'm just kind of resting there. Nothing still is happening. I'm just sitting there and there's nothing happening. There's just absolute stillness and silence. And I'm like, okay, I'm here now. I'll just wait. So you kind of wait for just something to happen. And then sometime later, this ground then starts to reveal itself. And there's a shift from darkness to light, where the darkness of consciousness then becomes light. And all of a sudden, you realize you are struck blind. That another term that I'll throw out here is what's called infused contemplation. Infused contemplation is a Christian term to describe the influx of divine light. And so God's light is kind of always shining on us, right? But a lot of us have up all these barriers so that the light doesn't hit us, right? The light kind of stays on the outside. And for most purposes, it's not really doing anything because there's so much resistance. But as we sort of let that go and kind of drop and strip away the resistance is, the light is kind of striking the soul relentlessly. It's like you're being blasted by this divine light. We call that infused contemplation. And so John the Cross says that this darkness is actually caused by an excess of light. It's beautiful. An excess of light. God is shining so much that the soul is struck blind. And that sense of being struck blind is that dark hole in the middle. And so you get to the bottom, so I'm at the bottom, and this starts to revert itself to light. And that's when I realized that this darkness is actually the absence of self, but also the positive presence of God. It was two things at once. But like being in a dark room, when you're in a dark room, you don't really adjust for a while. You gotta really sit and let your eyes adjust to the darkness. You start to see in the dark. And so this kind of resting down on this divine ground is the eye, the inner eye, adjusting itself, seeing God in a whole new way, a way that is unrecognized by consciousness. And so at that point, God reveals itself as the whole void itself. The whole void was God, right? But you don't know it until the inner eye adjusts to it enough. And so at that point, we call this in Christian mysticism the spiritual betrothal, or the spiritual engagement. And all that means is that God has now made a pledge in a way, like, I'm going to be with you now, right? Like, it's almost metaphorical, but, well, it is metaphorical. God's going to be with you now. Saying, okay, wow, I'm actually going to be united to God now, but it hasn't happened yet, right? The light has turned on, but it hasn't happened yet. And so I go on living my life, and yet you don't really know if this divine ground is permanent, because nothing has told you that it is yet. The Christian path really is about revelation. The divine reveals it to you, and it's the revelation of the divine that changes everything, right? It's that certitude that the divine gives. And so I'm living my life and uncertain. yeah, I have this beautiful divine presence in my heart that is much deeper than before, but is it permanent? You know, you don't know. And so about a year and a half after that event, when God struck me blind and there's this big hole in the center of myself, I was sitting in my room at my parents' house, and I was journaling at the time. And I felt this gust of grace kind of come out of the blue, kind of over me. And as it passed through me, I felt this sense of being uplifted in some way above myself, but then also going down in myself. So God is going up and down, this sense of being lifted up and then coming down. Then I had a vision. I had this vision of this beautiful garden, and the garden was my soul. And on the far end of the garden was this light, and the light was this beautiful, pristine, kind of white light. And as the light began to come towards where I was seeing this vision, right, I saw these reptiles and scorpions and all these little creatures scurrying out from the garden. Because during this process, there's a lot of unconscious resistance, that has to be released, because so much of this process is nature resisting grace. And so this whole point, the whole journey to this point, is this constant battle between nature and grace. Nature wants to stay stagnant. Grace is like, no, you have to expand. So there's this kind of this dichotomy where nature is all about limitation and grace is trying to expand you. And so in this dark night, what's happening is that God has to release all those forces so that nature never again gets in God's way. And so those reptiles signified those forces, and they're running for dear life. They actually have faces that I felt was kind of humorous. They were kind of like running for dear life. And the vision kind of comes, the light comes towards where I'm looking, and then it consumes the actual vision itself. And then I had a second vision after that, where I saw the divine put a ring on my finger. And so we call this bridal mysticism, right? God is now espousing itself to you. And once those visions ended, there was this sense now, I have arrived here. Like this union now. It's almost like God kisses you on the face and it's like, you're my bride, you're mine now. And it's a sense that is so indelible. It's like God makes contact. And the revelation here is that I will never let you go. But now you know it. Now you know it. And at that point, that changes everything. And we often call this the unitive revelation, when God reveals to us the depth of his oneness with us, that I will never let you go. Come what may, I will never let you go. And that is what this revelation is needed for. And so from that day forward, that was the onset, what we call in Christian mysticism, mystical union or spiritual marriage or divine union with God. That's what the experience is. And so the beautiful part about this journey is that it was a movement toward this unitive state, right? The ancient Christian fathers called this Theosis or deification, because the soul is now participating in the divine nature. And now the two are one. It's like a run-on when human nature now runs into divine nature. And this intersection within the soul is that tight intersection that is the heart of the union, that human nature and divine nature are now one, right? So that's what that signifies. So there's a sense of strength of this oneness with God. So that was a major milestone, this dark night of the spirit. It took about a year and a half for it to conclude itself. But that was the onset of the next major milestone. There's more to this experience, but to kind of condense it somewhat, shortly, that's what that experience was all about. So there's one particular phenomenon that Bernadette Roberts calls the will to God. And the will to God is basically this particular energy in the soul that has an attractor field to the divine. And this will to God is not us. So it's not like our own personal will. It's actually a cosmic will that is moving toward the divine. So when I was much younger, I began to notice in myself that there is something in me that loves God, but it's not me. I often ask myself, what is it in me that loves the divine this way, right? Because it wasn't me. It was something beyond my own powers. Like I don't have the capacity to love the divine this way. And so this will to God is this energy that's within the soul that is sort of, you can often say that it's the divine loving itself or the divine embracing itself. And so for me, one of the ways that I talk about, accelerating the journey, making it go by faster, is taking what I call the path of least resistance. Because I noticed that if I can get out of the way of this transcendent love, if I can not interrupt its movement in myself, it has a destination. It has something in mind. We call it spirit in action. It's eros. It's that part of us that is in us, but it's not of us, that has a natural attraction to the divine. And it's almost a shortcut, because so many of us spend a lot of our time striving and all this effort and all of this, contriving, and we're trying to make it work. We're trying to squeeze water out of the sponge, all these things. And I realized that the less effort I put in and the more I stay open to this will to God, the faster the journey goes. It's really a mystery and a secret, because this will to God is a force in the universe that is moving us toward unification, is moving us. And so I realized that even when I made mistakes and I was scared and didn't have courage, it was like, let me let the will to God do its thing. Let me step aside and let God love itself. And that force is working in me. It's working in us. And so for me, whenever I felt that I was lacking courage, the will to God has it all, right? And so you step aside and you let that power do its thing, so to speak. So that particular experience, we call that the will to God. There are other names for it and other traditions, but the will to God is essentially the divine loving itself in us. And the step aside is to let the divine consummate itself, consummate its own presence. And in process, we experience the after effects of that. So as this is happening, of course, we are, being the vessel and the host, are experiencing secondary effects, because grace works in us primarily, and what happens in our consciousness is actually secondary, because grace is working on a much more primordial level than our consciousness. It's going right to the soul, but it's the consciousness that actually experiences the secondary effects of grace. It's not the primary effects. It bypasses consciousness. It goes right to the soul. And once the soul starts transforming, it leaks out, and then it actually consumes and involves the rest of the self, the rest of the human being. I spent about 4 or 5 years in this unitive state, experiencing that. When in 2016, I was sitting in graduate school, a class where I felt something drop downward out of the body. And at first I thought, what happened, right? I wasn't sure what happened. So as I sort of observed what happened, I realized that in that moment, I actually lost all personal identification with the person of Shawn. Like Shawn as a separate self. Because in the Unitive State, what's amazing about it is that even though God reigns, so to speak, in the center of the soul, all of the activity around that center, the center is now God, is now divine light. Around that is still self. It's still your thoughts and your experiences and your memories and your desires. I mean, all that does not go away. What happens is that the divine reveals itself, and now all these pieces now conform. They have a new position now around the center. Whereas prior to that, the ego center or the self center was that which our self fragmentedly kind of organized around. So this unitive state is a state where God's in the center, and yet self still revolves around that, right? All this activity. So there's still a sense that I am myself in that state. It's just that now I have the continuous awareness of God's presence in myself, and also in creation. So the shift here is that you go from a subject-object union with God to more of a subject experience where there is no object anymore. And I realized at that point that I lost God as an object to myself. That vanished. But yet there was this vast cosmic subject that was sort of observing everything. I think the Hindus call this Turiya, right? This dimension where you're observing all that is arising, but it's not you doing it, right? It's something else doing it. And so it's very important to mention this too, is that in the Christian mystical tradition, right, we say Christian mystic because Christ here is known very differently. So Christ in this condition is known as subjectivity. It's an intelligence that's actually working through consciousness, right? And so I didn't talk about this, but there's a moment in the Unitive State where it's revealed that I am not personally one with God. Rather, it is Christ within me. When I say Christ, I don't mean Jesus. So Jesus and Christ are actually separate, right? Jesus is the personality. Christ is the actual cosmic intelligence. It's the oneness of divine and human nature. And it was Christ that was kind of working through Jesus as a vessel. But Christ is not contingent on Jesus or contingent on anybody else. It's a cosmic power that is uniting the divine and the human. And so it's Christ within as this cosmic intelligence that knows this oneness. And so as this object God drops away, Christ sort of falls back and begins to really be that which contemplates or that which knows reality. It's Christ that now is contemplating the divine, right? And so it's now more of a Christ consciousness in the sense that the divine Christ, which is one with everything, is now contemplating everything. But for that to happen, you have to disidentify with yourself, right? In all facets, because all the finite qualities that make you who you are, your thoughts, all these things, they still come up, but you don't identify with those things anymore. It's almost like they happen, but they aren't mine. Like I have thoughts, but they aren't my thoughts, right? I have feelings and emotions, but they are not mine. They just kind of come up. And so this freedom from this self-identification allows you to fall back even further. And now Christ, as this cosmic presence, is now looking at everything. And I share this interesting fact is that about a couple of years ago, I was walking my dog, and for a while, I thought I was losing my eyesight. I was going blind. And that's because I would look around and I could no longer pick up particular objects. You know how like our senses pick up, TV, a person, a dog, you kind of zero in on the objects. Then I realized that somehow my vision, my senses even, were actually going beyond what appears, beyond the particular, and was now moving to contemplate the universal. I went to the eye doctor, said, hey, my vision's acting up. He checks my eyes, your eyes are perfect. I'm like, what? And so then I started to think, like, wait a minute, right? Something else is happening here. And that's when I realized that Christ was actually contemplating through the physical organism. It's not just like formless and intangible, like the body is now participating in this incarnational sort of contemplation where you have Christ now coming through the body and looking at all that exists in its own kind of vast universal consciousness. And so that particular state grows by the day, right? So as I live my life, that state gets more and more deep. And my wife is like, you're changing. Like, where is my husband, right? He's not here anymore. And I'm like, you don't notice, right, all those effects on those who are around you. But this state is changing how the body functions. Like the cells even are contemplating now. Like the Christ consciousness is now permeating the entire system. And so you go from a subject-object, unification to now the Christ consciousness is now contemplating all that exists, the oneness of everything. So that's where I'm at now. And I kind of have glimpses of what you call enlightenment. Enlightenment is basically the collapse of all subject and objects, right? So even in this state, there's still a subject, even though it's cosmic, that's kind of contemplating everything. But the next step would be even for this to fall away. right? So that's the next step. And I know that's there because I've experienced that, but it's not permanent. And so, and you're noticing your spiritual life, sometimes you get a glimpse of a state, but it's not permanent. You kind of go back to your baseline state, right? And so, it's just amazing to think about the movement, right, throughout the journey that is happening very gradually, and that grace is the motivating force that's kind of moving this more and more. In a lot of ways, we're becoming more human and also more divine. And so it's a very humbling experience as well. And I feel very grateful for all that has transpired and all that's to come. I think every religion, takes this trip, right, to the ultimate realm, the ultimate spirit. And I think that we take it in different routes. I study in a lot of the other religions, as you know, other spiritual systems. And I will say that people often say that people that, have these experiences shouldn't have religion anymore. There are a lot of people that have the view that this experience is kind of beyond religion. But for me, as a Christian mystic, what is very obvious to me is that Christ is the subjectivity of the entire thing. And so Christian mystic to me means, I identify with the interior mystical life of Christ, right? And so for me, I look at my own religion and I see the ways in which it has supported me throughout all of these changes. And I know for a fact that without my faith, I wouldn't be where I am today, right? Because every faith has its own mystical dimensions, right? You have Sufism and Islam, you have Jewish Kabbalah and Judaism, you have different kind of sects in all these religions that go really far spiritually, because the mysticism is something that will be discovered by any true seeker of God in that tradition. It's almost inevitable that they'll find it. The yogis, out in the East, the Hindus and the Buddhists and Taoists, they all discover that to go to the next realm, so to speak, you have to go beyond the self, right? The self has to be transcended because the self is separate, right, from what is. And so the ultimate leap, the ultimate step is to go beyond the self. And so really the journey is a journey of more and more silence, right? The self is being silenced over time. And as self is silencing, the divine is increasing within us to the point when you'll just fall off. And all there is just the infinite, right? The ultimate spirit. And every religion has a way of sort of interpreting that. And I'm one that's very integral minded. So, I think every tradition offers something different in terms of how we understand what that reality is. And so for me as a Christian mystic, it's seeing how Christ is that in me that loves the divine, is that in me that is truly one with the divine, is that in me that is moving the whole journey, right, towards the deeper end. It's very interesting because one of the hard things about this journey is that you tread these very delicate psychic balances, meaning that there, for me at least, there are a lot of fears around psychosis, right? It's like you're walking these very fine lines. And it's like, if I'm blown off this thread, I could be lost forever, right? So there's these fears that come up where it's like, you have to even let go of doing, let go of prescription and predetermination. And so for me, one thing I noticed in my own journey was that nature itself has an intelligence that governs the human organism. But yet it's an intelligence that we aren't normally conscious of because we're living from ourselves, from our conscious or ego, right? And so you look at, a tree, or you look at, something natural, innate, something natural in the world, there's an intelligence there that governs what happens. So part of the journey really is learning to surrender into this intelligence, an intelligence that might even be superior to, other forms of intelligence, a sensory intelligence, right? And so the journey really is about trusting that the body knows what has to happen. A friend of mine once told me that the silence knows what has to happen next. The silence knows what has to happen next. So as long as we're thinking that you have to understand it mentally, that's when I get the most fragmented, is when I'm a nurse as well. So I'm in a hospital working with, kids with cancer. If I'm, hanging my chemotherapy and doing all these things, I'm not thinking about what's happening, right? It's more like trusting that the body knows what has to happen, right? The body, you trust in the body knows how to show up and appear and kind of be with what has to happen. And so really there's this sense of living in the moment more and more. I mean, it's not permanent. And there are times when I can definitely, be a little intellectual, a little analytical, and that's fine. But for me, the journey is about even letting go of these notions of doing. It's really about trusting that there's another intelligence now that's taking over what used to govern your behavior and govern what you do. And with that being said, the personality also is still there, right? It still arises, but you don't identify with it anymore. But it doesn't mean it's not there, right? And so one thing we don't want to do is spiritually bypass personality defects. The personality is not perfect, right? So one of the things that I work on in the Enneagram is working on getting feedback from others, how I show up in the world, and also looking at, how can this spirit show up through the personality in a way that's not defective or shadowy, right? So shadow work is something that has to be done on every level. So you never get to a point where you're just living in no self state, enlightenment state, and there's no shadow work, right? And so shadow work is something that I always do now. I'm looking at the blind spots because there's still unconscious filters that are there that are being expressed, right? And so really it's about how can we practice a holistic approach to enlightenment as opposed to saying, oh, I'm enlightened now, and so I don't gotta do any more work on myself, right? And so really for me, the work is integral. It's the spiritual intelligence, right, of letting it come through, but it's also getting feedback from my wife, like something I said triggered you, right? What did I say? Why did I say it? So the things like that you never are too advanced to not get feedback, to not discover parts in yourself that are disowned or not there. Because spiritual intelligence is just one part of being human. We have emotional intelligence, we have cognitive intelligence, social intelligence, all those kind of forms of intelligence. And so really to have a more full enlightenment, we need to make sure that we're growing in all dimensions so that the spirit can kind of come through us more clean. I do think that, evolution is this creative force, in this physical room that we're in right now. And I do believe that ultimately human nature is moving toward that place where you'll see, more people awakening, more people reaching enlightenment states. But one thing that I definitely want to mention is that even though it's happening in greater numbers now than I think has ever had happened before, I still think that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of our worldview. Like there's still a lot of mythic people that are having these experiences and kind of are not developing some of the higher levels of how do we interpret what's happening as well. But to answer your question, I do think that, a utopian society is, the ideal, obviously, but also I don't want to discredit this notion of suffering, that suffering is part and parcel of nature, and that suffering is redemptive, and that there is something transformational about suffering. And I do think that a lot of us have an aversion to suffering or an aversion to owning our own suffering. And I think the way forward, especially the Christian mystic, we talk a lot about suffering being redemptive, that suffering is able to purify, expand, enlighten us. So I do hope that going forward, we don't become so biased toward enlightenment states that we don't embrace suffering, because suffering is a part of the human condition. And suffering is something that opens the door, it cracks open the heart. And any avoidance of suffering, is an avoidance of the divine, because the incarnation really is about suffering, meeting divinity, suffering intersecting with divinity. And so for me as a Christian mystic, I'm really big on the relationship between human suffering and divine enlightenment, because the two sort of go together. So I only hope that, over the next hundreds of years, that as a species, we can kind of move past egocentric behaviors and more into, a communal, maternal way of being. But I do think there's a place also for the paternal as well. So like the forces of masculine and feminine do have to sort of coalesce, I feel, to have more of a full experience. And the Divine Mother, I didn't mention anything about this, but the Divine Mother is also a huge part of my spiritual journey as well. And so maybe another time we can talk about, my experiences with that. But yeah, I think we are going the right direction. And I do think that suffering is something that we should not avoid. We shouldn't be causing it, right, to others. But when it happens, we should look into it, because the divine is speaking to us through our suffering as well.